Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by.
Welcome to today's meeting of the Housing Committee. Members of the public may like to follow at London Assembly on social media and use the hashtag London Housing for this meeting. Please may I remind participants to silence your devices. Our main item of business this morning is a discussion on housing for women leaving prison. Before we begin, we have a few short items of business. Can I ask our clerk, Diane Richards, if any apologies have been received?
Thank you, Chair. Apologies for absence have been received today from Assemblymember Lord Bailey and also from Assemblymember Cooper, for whom Assemblymember Baker will be substituting today.
Thank you. Can I ask the committee to note the recommendations set out at item 2 and ask if members have any other interests to declare? Great. Can we confirm the minutes of the meeting held on 12th of December 2024? Can we note the completed, closed and outstanding actions arising from previous meetings and the additional correspondence received? Can we note the recent action taken by me as Chair under delegated authority in consultation with party group lead members to agree the committee's response to the Mayor's plan of action to end rough sleeping consultation? Great. That brings us to our main item of business, housing for women leaving prison. Can I please welcome our panel of guests? Rose Parker, Head of Commissioning for Safer Communities at the London Borough of Lambeth. Elizabeth Jimenez Yanez, Head of Policy and Public Affairs at Hibiscus. And Zaiba Qureshi, who's returning to the committee. Welcome back. And she is Chief Executive Officer at Housing for Women. So I will take the first few questions, and it would be really helpful. Actually, we'll start first with a brief introduction of what your organisation does, just a minute or so, and then I'll start with the questions. Start with Rose.
Thank you. So I work for Lambeth Council. I'm the Head of Commissioning for Safer Communities. So my service oversees commissioning and our strategic and operational approaches to people in contact with the criminal justice system, including specialist support for women, and also our violence against women and girls, or VAWG commissioning services. So that's the areas of responsibility.
Thank you. Elizabeth.
Hi, good morning. I'm Elizabeth Jimenez Yanez, Head of Policy and Public Affairs at Hibiscus. Hibiscus is a voluntary sector organization that supports Black and minoritized migrant women in contact with the criminal justice system and the immigration system. We provide high-impact support and advocacy for women in prison and detention centers as well, and in the community. We've been working with Black and minoritized migrant women for over 30 years. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And then finally, Zaiba.
Hi, good morning. I'm Zaiba. I'm the Chief Exec of Housing for Women. We are a housing association and charity based in London. We're celebrating our 90th birthday this year. We provide general needs accommodation across 9 boroughs in London, and we also have a supported housing arm which includes services really under the umbrella of violence against women and girls, including domestic violence services, refugees outreach, services for trafficked women, and also supported housing accommodation for women on release from prison.
Thank you. That's all really helpful. We had hoped to have a representative from H&P Bronzefield that we visited last year, but they were unable to attend. So some of our questions that were to be directed to them, we may ask you your views on those issues. So let me get to the first question then, to Elizabeth. What are the main barriers to safe and secure accommodation for Black and minoritized migrant women who have left prison? And Rose and Zaiba, you may have views on that, but we'll start with Elizabeth.
Thank you very much. I guess just to begin, I want to acknowledge and mention that we are really pleased that there's an opportunity to have a specific discussion on the particular experiences of Black and minoritized migrant women. You already had 2 panels in which you had the opportunity to understand a little bit better the experiences of women, but as you can imagine, the experiences of those who are subjected to marginalization can be completely different from them, right? As I said before, we are a frontline organization providing support and doing policy and advocacy, so all the evidence that I'll be presenting here today, it's informed by our frontline service, which is very valuable. Something very important in terms of the context, we know that the journey through the criminal justice system is not the same for everyone. Systemic racism and other forms of intersecting discrimination shape the experience of our service users and other Black and minoritized migrant women who are in prison, and therefore there's an impact in their access to housing, right? As a matter of context, last year we launched a report called Unsafe, Insecure, and it was based on the experiences of housing, not only from women who leave prison, also the women we support in the community and immigration removal centers. And something that it's important to mention is that 50% of the women that we supported in the community between 2023 and 2024 reported having housing needs, and a third of them were survivors of violence against women and girls and other forms of harm, such as trafficking. And we supported them with housing needs, and we noticed that those with housing needs were twice as likely to suffer from mental health issues. So there's compounding barriers, as you can see in there. When we talk about specifically women leaving prison, black and minoritized migrant women leaving prison, there's multiple and overlapping barriers that many of them are structural barriers and are created by the way policy, especially immigration policy, has been designed in the UK, right? What we know and what we see is that the women we support have higher needs and vulnerabilities, and these needs are on top of the vulnerabilities that were described in the previous panels that you had that women experience. Some of them had to do with the structural and systemic discrimination. For instance, we know that black and minoritized migrant women are more likely to be remanded in prison, receive short sentences compared to British women, right? There's a specific element that for the work that we do supporting women plays such a huge barrier, and is the non-recourse to public funds policy that, as you might know, has been found to be discriminatory by the High Court, and we see the impact that it has on the women we support, because basically they are not entitled to access the housing programs and the means that other women might be able to access, such as CAS 2 and CAS 3. They are completely forbidden from using that because they don't have access to benefits, right? Something very specific that we see and that has an impact on the women we support is the lack of planning for women's release. There's not a specific planning, and when you have overlapping barriers, you would need to have a clear plan so you can interact and you can connect with the different agencies. The specific experiences of the women we support would be shaped by the immigration status, right? As I said, it's no recourse to public funds, but it's also the fact that they might have undocumented status, they might need to access an immigration solicitor to sort out the situation. And what we see is that as they are leaving prison, there's not a real plan for them to do that. So lots on that falls into the organization to support the woman because the agencies are not taking responsibility for that. There's something in there as well that we see in supporting women in prison before they left. There's lots of barriers for them to apply to asylum and also to apply to protection when they are victim survivors of trafficking. It's almost impossible to do an NRM referral, national referral mechanism referral within the prison, that for someone who's a victim survivor might be helpful when they leave prison to access safe and secure housing, right? Specifically because of the situation of vulnerability they might be placed by being released without any accommodation, safe accommodation. Something very specific that applies for migrant women is that we see a statutory failure to address communication barriers. So we don't see necessarily agencies using interpreters and making sure that women understand what they've been told. The criminal justice system, prison, is very complex. Imagine if your first language is not English and you're unable to understand what's basically happening to you. I'm going to stop there because I think there's going to be an opportunity in the other questions to go in depth into some of these barriers. But basically, as I said before, the experiences of the women that we see are shaped and are compounded by their protector characteristics that are not necessarily, there's not necessarily action to meet their specific needs and to comply with the public sector equality duty under the Equality Act.
Thank you. So if I could go to Zyba on the same question around black and minoritized women, but obviously you're very welcome to expand that question beyond, because I know that your organisation works with a whole breadth of women. And then to Rose, Elizabeth said that there is quite often no planning. You are, I think, one of the few local authorities that does do planning. So if you could talk about kind of how you plan for safe and secure accommodation for women when they leave prison. But we'll start with Zyba.
Okay, so in terms of black and minoritized migrant women, I'd sort of echo what Elizabeth said in terms of the structural inequality and discriminatory barriers that women face when they're in prison, but I won't go on any more on that, given that Elizabeth's given quite an in-depth response on that. In terms of our engagement with black and minoritized migrant women, we've only had 2 referrals of women fitting that category in the last 6 months. One had no recourse to public funds, and we were unable to house her, as that sort of reflects what Elizabeth was saying, essentially. There's no availability of funding for rent or service charges for those individuals. We did have one other woman who was referred to us who had discretionary leave to remain, who was able to access our accommodation and access housing benefit and other benefits. So, as a matter of course, we don't normally take migrant women unless they have some sort of discretionary leave to remain and access to public funds. In terms of intersectionality, the way that we deliver our services is very specific. We adopt a personalised, trauma-informed approach in terms of a model of support. That means that each woman's diverse needs can be considered and can be supported appropriately. That could include cultural or faith support or language support where that's appropriate, and also referral to peer support from grassroots community groups and signposting to any specialist support.
Thank you. So in Lambeth, yes, we've got specialist-specific posts. So we've got prison release navigator post, and then also we have single persons navigators. So I think in terms of the importance of these roles is that they're flexible, proactive, preemptive, so the ability to do that tailored support, the ability to do in-reach, to build really strong working relationships with prisons, with probation, so this is across genders, not just for women, but that bit around being able to carry out those assessments while someone's still in custody, that's obviously dependent on when a referral is received, so that can often be very last minute, but it means that it's not waiting for somebody to be released and then to present as homeless at housing. It means that lots of that is then that preemptive work, so the assessments that's looking at their specific needs and really doing that work, not just around their kind of priority need. That was in the first committee hearing. It was a lot about, hearing was about a priority need, but actually before that, most of the women that are coming through that are being assessed through our specialist posts don't get to that assessment because they are eligible for supported accommodation. So that tends to be the route that they're then pursuing. But it's really meaning that we're able to build really strong relationships with not just the prisons and probation, but also those third sector providers that can be really supportive in doing the things around getting somebody's ID, getting all of the bits around making sure that they've got all of their holistic needs met, and that obviously has to take an intersectional approach, looking at somebody's whole array of needs. So it's really making sure that somebody does have their personal housing plan ahead of release where possible, and that really is around then assessing all of their needs. And for Lambeth, that's in the context of a strategic prioritisation of those those specific needs, and around taking an intersectional approach. So I think I touched on the fact that my work is both the VAWG services, violence against women and girls services, but also services for adults in contact with the criminal justice system and specialist support for women. So we opened the Beth Centre in Lambeth in 2013. So that was funded through the London Crime Prevention Fund, MOPAC's funding, Mayor's Office Policing Crime funding at that point, and that really was looking at the fact that we knew that women did have specific needs, that was really tied and overlapping and intersecting with violence against women and girls, particularly domestic abuse and sex working and sexual exploitation. So I think it may come later around talking about our role as now co-commissioners in the Pan London Women's Service, but it has always been both that we've got a strategic commitment to those specialist needs, those specific needs, but also within our housing services that there is real benefit to taking that flexible, proactive and preemptive approach, because it means that you can do preventative work and mean that you're not waiting and then having to react to somebody's needs when they present as homeless.
Okay. And just out of interest, what kind of numbers are you dealing with on a monthly, annual basis?
Really quite small numbers. So for between in the whole of the calendar year 2024, the Prison Relief Service had 399 referrals, 46 of which were for women, so that's 11.5%, and that only represented 34 individual women. I think that's actually a really important point, is 26% of those women were referred into the pathway more than once. That's compared to only 5% of men. So really demonstrating that bit around the kind of disruptive impact of short-term sentences, but also the additional complexity of the needs of those women being released, that they are usually often experiencing multiple disadvantage. So we're talking about not just their experience in the criminal justice system, but substance misuse, mental health, violence against women and girls, removal of children, care that they themselves were in care as children. So I think that's much clearer that is a specific bigger need for women than it is for the men who are referred to the service.
Thank you so much. My next question is to Elizabeth. If you could just briefly outline your Double Disadvantage project. Are there any key recommendations from that project that would benefit from mayoral support?
Thank you. So I guess as a matter of context, the Tackling Double Disadvantage project has rebranded. So we are now called Women's Justice Reimagined. Part of why we did that was a consultation with women themselves in terms of trying to understand the intersectionality of their experiences in a better way. It's not about a double disadvantage, it's about how many disadvantages intersect with each other and create the experience of precarity. So I just wanted to mention that. But thank you for inviting us to talk about this. So this is a partnership project that we have with other organizations, Muslim Women in Prison, Agenda Alliance, Criminal Justice Alliance, and Sahid Mubarak Trust. And we're working together to transform the way that the criminal justice system responds to Black and minoritized migrant women. As I mentioned before, we all know about the disproportionality towards Black, minoritized and migrant communities and the particular experiences of women, right? There's lots of evidence, and there's been lots of reviews on that. Basically, what we've been doing for the last years, it's been to work in an action plan. So we have a 10-action plan that we've been presenting to different stakeholders in terms of how we can transform the system, right? We have specific actions. We are at the moment reviewing this action plan, trying to, I guess, understand the context of all the transformations that are happening in the criminal justice system, the sentencing review. Today they are announcing the members of the Women's Justice Board, so we see there's an opportunity to do something and be very explicit and specific about the experiences of the women we support, right? In terms of recommendations, I think the recommendations that we can bring up from the action plan and from the work that we're doing as a partnership has to do with valuing and continuing the co-commissioned women specialist wraparound services. We work in collaboration with Women in Prison and Advance as part of the co-commission project, and we see the value that this has to women. Also, we see the value that involving an organization such as Hibiscus that works directly with Black and minoritized migrant women, that has the expertise, but not only that has the trust of women. This is very important. The women we support are completely terrified of any contact with any agency, right? So through the advocacy support that we do, we provide better means, and we advocate on their behalf, because as you can imagine, many of them might be perceived as not having access to any rights because of their lack of immigration status, or their no recourse to public funds condition, which is something misunderstood as equal to not having access to any type of support, which is false, because there's different categories of women who are subjected to no recourse to public funds, and that's important to say, right? As part of the work that we do, and something that we would welcome the support of the mayor, is looking for a specific training for agencies that consider the expertise that we have and that can be shared with them in terms of how do you work with migrant women? How do you understand the vulnerabilities they are exposed to, and how do you address and tackle them, right? And the expertise that we have doing this work on a daily basis is very important. In the first panels, many of the speakers talk about the postcode lottery in terms of how different is the approach and the response towards women. That's something that we believe with training, but also with accountability, can be sorted out. So having a consistent approach across local authorities and local authority housing teams is very important, and we think that can be to the benefit of the women we support. We also think that the mayor can support us in involving the Home Office and immigration officers in these conversations, because part of what happens in terms of the experiences of women, as I said before, the lack of preparation also involves lack of contact with the Home Office, a lack of knowledge of where are the applications. For instance, if there's a specific application for immigration status, that might end up in this woman having access to recourse to public funds. But there's a complete disconnect between the agencies, and what we have at the end is women leaving in prison sometimes without enough information to make the case for them to access housing. So I think at the moment, these three recommendations mirror what we have done as a partnership, and we think the mayor can do that. The last one, sorry, I said three, and I forgot the most important one. So in terms of co-commissioning, if there's a specific pot of funding for women with no recourse to public funds, that's something that can be very beneficial in terms of allowing them to access accommodation. In the violence against women and girls sector, there's a national pilot. They call it a pilot, but I think it's now a program because it's been in place since 2021, that it's the Migrant Victim Domestic Abuse scheme that basically allows victim survivors with no recourse to public funds to access accommodation that it's paid by this specific pot of funding, that it's a national pot of funding, but something to replicate at a London level would be beneficial for women, but also for services. As it was already mentioned, there's a lot of pressure for services having to say no to women with no recourse to public funds who have the needs of housing.
Thank you very much. So that kind of leads us on nicely to the next question. I'll start with Zaiba this time. How could agencies adopt a more intersectional approach to providing women who have left prison with housing support to ensure the needs of different groups of women are being met? We've already touched, somebody's talked about supported housing, but your views would be really helpful. To start with Zaiba.
I think I've said some of this before, basically, but I think really ensuring that we have good in-reach into prisons and understanding the individual needs of women themselves at the earliest stage, working with the prisons and trying to link women into sort of community support like the Beth Centre and Advances community support as well. I think that we already provide some in-reach in terms of referrals to our services, so we are able to garner a lot of that information at the source, and I think replicating that across other agencies is the way forward in terms of trying to address intersectional needs. Could you repeat the question again, Sam? Sorry.
Yeah, sure. How could agencies adopt a more intersectional approach to providing women who've left prison with housing support?
So, I think, as I've said, basically, it's about understanding the full picture, the person-centred approach of any individual, really. And I think working with other agencies who have that access. Sometimes it might not be through that agency themselves. It might be working with statutory authorities or with voluntary sector partners to get that information.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Elizabeth and then Rose.
I think it starts with the recognition of the different experiences of women and how actions can be taken to tackle this disadvantage, right? From our perspective, local government can take a more proactive approach to applications for housing and homelessness to help and support Black and minoritized migrant women, even if they have no recourse to public funds. I know it's a challenge because there's no specific funding, but it connects to the recommendation I had before. Something very important is to improve recognition and identification of victims of trafficking, modern slavery, and violence against women and girls, and provide them with the means of support that it's needed, right? We think that existing models of support, such as CAS 2 and CAS 3, should be extended to all women without discrimination, especially because when you think about intersectionality, you also need to think about the vulnerabilities that the increased vulnerabilities that these Black and minoritized migrant women are going to experience once they leave prison. So therefore, excluding them, it's facilitating exploitation, it's facilitating them having to return to unsafe accommodation. So we recently had a couple of cases of women who didn't have access to public funds, and we managed to find some temporary accommodation for them, but it wasn't suitable, right? So they preferred to stay in very risky accommodations they were living in. So the risk of them being re-victimized or the risk of them falling into further harm is very high, but the reality is that the alternative is not necessarily safe, suitable for them. So it's a very difficult position to be in, right? Finally, again, and I'm sorry, I'm going to be repeating some of these recommendations, but training and guidance is very important, and training and guidance need to be done in collaboration with organizations that have the expertise. And something that I always add to the elements of training and guidance that has become a little bit of a buzzword is the accountability that needs to follow these processes. It's not helpful just for someone to take one training once per year and then say, like, okay, now I understand the issue, and then fail to support this specific group of women. So, yeah, these are the points.
Okay, thank you. And then finally, Rose.
Thank you. So I think there's something around data, so knowing the broader picture of people's experiences and how useful that can be, and that obviously for a local authority, we have the data for the people that are coming to our attention, but not necessarily those that aren't. And I think that's always the really helpful bit, is around who holds what data and how can we pull that all together to give a stronger picture. Also in terms of intersectionality in the round, so obviously the importance of a tailored intersectional approach for Black and minoritized migrant women, but also thinking that that intersects with those with disabilities, LGBTQI+, women and non-binary people leaving prison. So really thinking about all of those different bits and how those intersect with one another. There are issues around the lack of accessible housing. That is an issue really broadly. Things like recently they said that 1% of refugees, domestic abuse refugees, are wheelchair accessible. There's a really big things around the kind of things that needs for non-binary or trans women. So thinking about those specialist services. So again, it does come back to that in-reach, a person-centred approach, as you said, relationship building, so meaning that we're drawing on the relationships, and that's one of the benefits, is having single points of contact. So I think for Lambeth, that's really important. Agencies know who to contact. That person has a bit of time to build a relationship, to elicit information that they might not otherwise be told, that could inform what somebody is, both what is a more suitable accommodation for them, but also what their eligibility might be, other forms of accommodation or support that they may well be eligible for. So I think that is a really beneficial bit around our approach, is that the prison release navigator can do a lot of that relationship building, being proactive, but also thinking about that tailored support and about how they then work with specialist organisations who have the expertise and who then can think about what other more creative solutions there might be to meeting somebody's needs.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to hand over to Assemblymember Garbett now.
Morning, panel, and thank you for your contributions so far. So starting with a general question just about key challenges, and I know you've picked up on some of this, but maybe just to ask this in a different way to pull out some more information, but what are the key challenges faced by local authorities, prison services, probation and community and voluntary sector in providing housing support for women leaving prison? Shall I start with Rose and go back the other way?
So I think for local authorities, one, that not every local authority is the same. So I think that is actually really important, that I can only here speak for in terms of Lambeth. But there's 32 boroughs plus the City of London. They all look very different. They all have very different levels of resourcing, conflicting priorities. So I think that's one of there isn't necessarily a single approach. But capacity and resources obviously an issue, and it's around for Lambeth, we've had such a long-standing consideration and prioritisation of the needs of women in contact with the criminal justice system, but that's not the case for everywhere. So one of the barriers is around understanding the picture, is understanding, because they are smaller numbers, so that can sometimes mean that it's easy to lose the fact that they're smaller numbers, but they look very different, and their needs are different, and the ability to meet those needs and the impact of not meeting those needs is different. So I think for local authorities, it is around understanding what that is, understanding the value of that, but then it will also come back to conflicting priorities, capacity and resource, and that's going to be the issue for others. So things like we cannot do a in-reach if referrals don't come to us in a timely manner. So, but that is always going to be, again, coming back to what is the capacity issues for those services to make referrals, but also some of the understanding. So Elizabeth, you talked about training, so that's one of the bits that our specialist workers can do, is a lot of training, is awareness raising with our partners to really understand the benefit and around how to make those referrals, how to draw on the consultancy level expertise of our specialist posts. But yeah, I think that the key things are always going to come back to capacity and resource.
Well, capacity and resource, I think it's something that is going to be replicated by all of us in here. But when you think about an organization that focuses on supporting a group of women who are basically excluded from any type of support and provisions, the level of advocacy that you need to do as a frontline worker increases significantly, right? It's basically a fight. It's basically having to make agencies to take responsibility for what they need to do. But it's also dealing with the emotional burden of having to explain to women that there's no alternatives and, like what it means for someone who is completely vulnerable, right? But of course, frontline workers in the organization do their best in terms of advocating for women and finding alternatives. But this also leads to, of course, burnout. It leads to issues with retention. It's a very difficult job, the one that frontline workers do in the organization. And that's something we, of course, are concerned about because it links to the lack of sustainable funding, that it's long-term, and that it's really focusing on investing in a model that supports all women without discrimination, which is something that is important for us. I guess the challenge for us supporting migrant women comes from the immigration system itself, right? And the vulnerability that the immigration system creates in terms of pushing women to destitution, to very risky situations, and not understanding the intersectional needs that women do, and not acknowledging the evidence that shows that the criminal justice system treats Black and minoritized migrant women in a different way, right? So being a frontline and being one of the only frontline organizations that supports Black and minoritized migrant women living in prison, it's a constant challenge and it's a constant battle. So yeah, I think it links back to the idea of resourcing, to properly funding organizations, and the importance that this has to the organization itself, but more importantly to women themselves.
I think I'm just going to echo what's been said already, but hopefully in a slightly different way. I would agree there is a lack of consistency across all of the boroughs. I would say Lambeth are a particular star in that respect. We don't actually work with Lambeth, so I'm saying that as an outsider. But I think the co-commissioning and having the Violence Against Women and Girls umbrella in respect of how women coming out of prison are seen as well, I think that's a really great model. I think there's obviously a lack of safe and affordable housing, full stop. So that impacts, again, on this particular client group, so women leaving prison. I think for us, we're very clear that funding, sustained funding for long-term support services for women coming out of prison needs to be considered by the Mayor and any other commissioning authorities. We're very lucky. We're one of the very few organisations that has Ministry of Justice funding, but we know that's an exception to the rule, essentially. But I would say you can't have a sustained support service for any client group without having a long-term commissioned funding resource behind it. I think some of the other issues that we're facing and our sort of practice-based evidence is showing is a lack of understanding around local authority obligations around rehousing for women coming out of prison. They're still quite often seen as non-priority, and therefore they don't access the same housing pathways as they should. We've got housing pathway workers who spend a lot of time trying to overturn decisions and have been successful in that, but that in itself shouldn't need to happen. And I think one of the ways that the Mayor could help that is to strengthen the recommendation for local authorities to follow the Code of Practice or the Code of Guidance around homelessness, and also back to training and briefing, sort of improved training for local authorities, housing and homelessness teams.
Yes, Ms. Parker, you're here because we heard that what you're doing is brilliant, and I believe the Navigator accompanied us our visit.
Yes.
Accompanied us visit, and I was very impressed with what she had to say about how Lambeth are looking after the interests of those people who are due to be leaving, those women due to be leaving prison. What do we do to expand that in London? What are the mechanisms that you have? What are the bodies that you sit on or that Lambeth may have influence over that can spread that good practice to other boroughs?
Thank you. So I think that has been highlighted often, and we are unusual in that we're the borough that is a co-commissioner on the Pan-London Women's Service, and we were able to do that because we had long-standing relationships with Mayor's Office for Policing and Crime. We'd led the South London Alliance, which was funded through them, then was almost sort of mainstreamed into the Pan-London service. That's long-standing, and I think that's really important to be clear for other local authorities, is that this may seem newer, but also that I think that we have really established services, and we've had these specialist posts for a long time, even single persons navigator posts. So some of it is around just the, I guess, promotion of ways of doing things where good practice can be taken but tailored to the specific needs of each local authority, because they're not the same. But things like use of really strong commissioning teams. So I commission VORG and services and services for adults in contact with the criminal justice system, but we work really closely with our supported housing pathway commissioners, with our mental health commissioners, with our substance misuse commissioners. So lots of that is around how we can, examples of how commissioners can be creative in how we use funding and how we apply for funding, and how we, in times of much less resource, we are more efficient and creative in those relationship building. So I think we'd be caution that we are responding to very specific needs in Lambeth, but there are examples of things that we do that we would be very happy to see replicated, because we think that there is benefit to that. I was going to talk about another barrier for local authorities is that, as I touched on, we have higher numbers of recurring referrals, and that is because women experience multiple disadvantage at much higher rates in the prison population than men. So there are obviously then higher support needs when they're coming to us. Also that they're coming to the attention of agencies later. So almost by that point, the needs are much greater. They're perhaps more entrenched in offending, or in often for us, that's things like involvement in sex work and sexual exploitation, as well as domestic abuse. So there's just so much higher, greater need, and that can be more difficult to meet, particularly in that context of capacity and resource, but also that generic services aren't generic. They're designed for men. So because they're designed for the majority, we talk about generic services. They're not generic. They are designed for men and historically by men. And I think that's a really important point, because it means that we almost think of this as a separate thing, but also when we're talking about gender responsive services, men have a gender. That's an important part of their identity as well. So actually we need to be thinking about that more broadly. When we talk about gender responsive services, we know that men make up the majority of those in the criminal justice system. So their gender is important, and it does mean that the systems and the services designed for them were never designed to meet the needs of women, and they're not designed to meet the needs of trans and non-binary people as well. So, yeah, I think we would always want to see it replicated, but same as services need to be tailored to each of the individuals, they need to be tailored to each of the different authorities.
I get that. I mean, it's why we have different boroughs, because actually every borough is different, but there's some things that are common to everyone. The housing shortage, the housing crisis, the unavailability of voids. I mean, that affects every single London borough. And yet Lambeth has done better in this area than other boroughs facing similar challenges. But I get the point that you need to tailor it. So what you're saying in this is, I seem to think it's about this very strong commissioning sort of philosophy that you have in Lambeth is the thing that does is your secret weapon, if you want.
Yeah, I think we've also, as a borough, got a really long history of social justice, of having that being a really big part of what we do, and our approaches. So I think an intersectional approach is not unusual to the way that we do things, but in order to do that, we can't do that. One team can't do that. To meet the needs of individuals, we need to work collectively and collaboratively. But we've had a long history of maximising available funding, of really working. Even the Beth Centre, when that was first designed 12 years ago, that also was the creation of Chrysalis, which was a specialist supported accommodation for women who were involved in sex work. And that was aligned with the Beth Centre model. So we've just got a very long history of that, and I think that's to say that might be more difficult. It's to, I guess, stress that we're not new to it, and that's why it's so embedded. But that there is lots of learning about how we do things that we would be very happy to share.
Thank you.
Grateful for the opportunity to be here today to share.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Assembly Member Small-Edwards.
Good morning, everyone. My first question is to Zyber, and it's how has your Reconnect programme supported women who have left prison? And what are the long-term housing outcomes for women who have participated in the Reconnect programme?
So just as a bit of background, just to say that we've had about 20 years of successfully developing and delivering services for women on their release from prison. So Reconnect Plus is sort of the latest incarnation of those services, essentially. So we have, I'll tell you a little bit about the project. I think that's really might be really helpful. So we have 10 bed spaces, so it's a very small project. I think it sort of harks back to what other panel members have talked about. We're talking about very small numbers, but a very distinct service. It was developed through collaboration with sister organisations like Hibiscus, Advance, Women in Prison, Clean Break, and the Prison Reform Trust, as well as some of the statutory authorities that we were already engaged with. And it was also supported by the Blueprint Delivery Group, of whom we are a member. And as I said, it's funded, the revenue funding stream for the support is through MOJ funding, and that's a bid that's funded us from 2023 and ends sometime in April. The project was funded to deliver up to 12 bed spaces. We currently have 10 bed spaces, and that's spread over two HMO type properties. I would say one of the keys to our success is having 24-hour support. It's expensive, but it works. I don't have any cost numbers with me today, but I can provide those later. The accommodation happens to be in Lewisham. Sorry, that was a bit of a faux pas. Happens to be in Lewisham. That's just so happens to be where we were able to get properties, and they're reasonably they're located fairly closely together, although they're not sort of next to each other. Essentially, we work with Lewisham local authority housing department really closely in terms of some of our move on options, but we also work with private landlords, and because we also have our own general needs accommodation, we're able to provide some move on for those women who've come through that project through our own stock. As I say, we provide 24-hour support, up to 6 months support at any given time. That's not a strict cut-off. It's really dependent on each woman's individual needs. But the aim is really to move them on to more permanent accommodation in the wider community. To date, we've moved 8 women through the project into accommodation through a range of landlords, as I said, either ourselves or local authority. Our recall rate has been exceptional, so we've had 0 recall for all of the women over the last 12 months. And I would say that's really attributable to, we set up the project really with a trauma-informed environment. We got a consultant in to help us actually design the building in a way that was trauma-informed and would support women in their recovery, I guess, from their custodial sentences. Our specialist support providers deliver one-on-one support, as I said, through psychologically informed training. We actually have sort of properly, say we have proper supported housing models. So we've got on-site skilled staff. It's not just a case of staff visiting once or twice a week. People are there all the time. They're delivering things like group work, which might be around budgeting or relearning life skills, like cooking and looking after a household. We've dealt with the women that have come to us have had multiple disadvantages, so poverty, debt, mental health, physical or mental health issues, and drug and alcohol dependency in some cases. In terms of the outcomes, as I said, half of the women have been successfully rehoused. Our recall rate is really low, and I would say those are successful move-ons from a fairly small project, essentially.
Thank you very much. And Rose, what is Lambeth Council's approach to supporting women leaving prison with housing? And what are the long-term housing outcomes for women who have left prison and engaged with Lambeth services?
So I've touched on the fact that we've got our specialist referral support services specific for that. We also, in terms of our role as the co-commissioners, I think that's important to talk about. Lambeth previously led the South London Alliance. That was just in South London, was funded by MOPAC. But then we wanted to continue both to have the Beth Centre as the hub in Lambeth, but also to think about, we have evidence around the need. So we wanted to make sure that we retained expanded capacity to support both sentenced and unsentenced women in Lambeth. So it's that join up of those services, really close working in South London, that's women in prison, and the Beth Centre is our Lambeth hub, our community support service. So we have that tailored support, while the prison release navigator and the single person navigators are not specific to women. That is obviously a large part of what they do. We also have our supported accommodation pathway, and 25% of those in our supported housing are women. And I think the kind of main bit that we do is that tailored, person-centred support, and it is around being really proactive, really strong partnership working. But I suppose the main thing is a recognition that the needs of women are different, that our services need to be specific and specialist, and that the outcomes, I don't have outcome data, but in terms of, we know that there are higher numbers of returning women, so women coming back into our pathway. Some of that is about the shorter sentences that women receive. We know that there are issues around women on remand, so not getting the same support because there isn't the same duties to refer, so that can be very difficult, but there's a benefit there where we've got much stronger working relationships. As I said, that single point of contact to mean that people know and can be creative about how they offer support. We have people's ID, their documents on file, so that is helpful to them be able to do things in advance and last minute, because you can't get anybody into any form of accommodation without ID. So actually just having that and knowing the women is a benefit. But I think from my supported housing colleagues, it's to say that we know the benefit of specialist support that is gender responsive and is responsive to the specific needs and the intersectional needs of women.
Before you come back, can I just ask one thing? So you just mentioned briefly a duty to refer. Who would that duty fall to? And is it something that would be London-wide, at a national level, at a local level?
Yeah, that's the statutory duty to refer, so that's for prisons and probation.
So there's no duty for...
Women on remand.
Oh, OK. So that's something that would be useful?
Yes. Okay. I don't know whether whether there'd be more specialism there, but you can almost do that two ways of obviously having the kind of proactive specialist workers who are more expanded. I mean, one of the problems, obviously, that we need to touch on for women specifically, there isn't a London prison. They are so much further away from services. So that is a really significant issue because you're then very dependent on timely referrals, on creative responses like video calling or whatever. But that is one of the biggest things, is that women in London are really far away. They're far away from their support, they're far away from services, and they're returning very last minute often. So, with the remand cases, there's not really necessarily, they don't have probation officers, they're not entitled to CAS 3 accommodation or approved premises, so they're often released straight from court. So if they go, it's either that they are released because it's time served or not guilty. But then that means that they're released really last minute.
OK. Assemblymember Boff, and then back to you, Assemblymember Small-Edwards.
Just on what you mentioned, Chair, is that I'm still fascinated by how the Homelessness Reduction Act has an effect on women leaving prison, because there is a duty under the Homelessness Reduction Act for local authorities to prevent homelessness. It doesn't seem to be working in respect of women leaving prison, whether or not it's remand or whether or not they've finished a sentence. That is still a person who desperately is in need of accommodation, and yet local authorities don't seem to factor them in. I wonder if you could, your impression of how that works with Homelessness Reduction Act.
So I can't speak on behalf of other local authorities, and I think for Lambeth it is about that prevention. So that's a really key point, is that majority, as I said, majority of the women who are referred are not reaching, most people are not reaching the homeless application stage, the statutory Part 7 homeless application stage, because the assessment of their needs then offers up options that are preventative options. So particularly in Lambeth, it's the supported housing pathway, but we have a strong supported housing pathway offer. And I think there probably is discrepancies in the application, but a lot of that does come down to resource, again, that it's people who are presenting on the day. There will still be a housing assessment that is looking at preventative options for them. It's just that it's still dependent on them turning up on the day, as opposed to really proactive in reaching to prisons or work with probation to get that information early and to do the housing assessments early.
Thanks, Rose. And in your initial response, you referenced the South London Alliance project. And so I just want to speak a bit about that and ask, how effectively did the project facilitate a whole system approach to supporting women leaving prison across those 6 South London authorities involved?
Well, I suppose the largest side of its impact was that it was then mainstreamed into the Pan-London office. So I think that's, for us, we've really welcomed the opportunity to take that learning, not just from leading the South London Alliance, but Lambeth's work over the years. So obviously we had the Beth Centre 12 years ago. That was originally Eves, and now Women in Prison. And that was really looking at, again, those specific needs of women, taking some of that preventative work as well, so unsentenced as well as sentenced women, and in the community. But so it's been 2 years as co-commissioners, so that's with the Mayor's Office for Police and Crime, I imagine HMPPS or the Ministry of Justice and the NHS. That's been really beneficial for us. It's meant that we've been able to maintain capacity for Lambeth women, that we've been able to work really closely with Women in Prison and their partners, both for that main contract, but then to look at, well, how do we align things like our violence against women and girls services with those services? How do we access funding across the board that can best meet the needs of those women? How do we then strengthen our work with our supported housing accommodation partners or our other commissioners across the service to really think about the specific needs and that real preventative bit? As I said, the needs of women are much greater. They experience multiple disadvantage at a greater rate. So that does require us to think creatively. And I think we've really welcomed the opportunity to be co-commissioners. We want that to continue. And having that pan-London service, I think, is very beneficial in driving the data, the understanding of the picture, and also the case for other areas to adopt any examples of best practice. So, yeah.
Thank you. Assembly Member Baker, please.
Thanks, Chair. I'd like to ask a couple of questions about the Blueprint Delivery Group, which, Zyba, you've mentioned earlier. So firstly, I'd like to ask, do you feel the London Blueprint Delivery Group is delivering the aims it's set out to? And is it improving multi-agency practice? Elizabeth, did you want to start? Thanks.
Thank you. So, yes, we're part of the Blueprint Delivery Group, and it's a very important forum, and we find this as a very important forum to help drive change. We actively participate, and we find that the space allows to have specific discussions on the issues that we are interested into. Of course, linked to the recommendations I was sharing before, there's more that can be done in terms of how making sure that all women can access the provision and can be safe when they are leaving prison in terms of accessing housing. I guess part of the question, not now, but I know will come to the recommendations, right? And what we believe is that in order to continue working, it needs to be properly resourced to make sure that these meetings continue happening, but that there's also a bit of an action plan and I guess certain deliveries that we agree as a group to continue putting in place to make sure that the wealth of knowledge that is discussing there with all these different members of the group are put in practice, and it's not only a space in which the discussion happens and then nothing else materializes.
Yeah. Zyba.
Yeah, I'd say it's an invaluable forum. Essentially, we've been a member of the group for a number of years, and I think basically the whole systems approach, which has been talked about a lot today, is I would say that the Blueprint Group are they're the space essentially where all of those elements come together, all of those agencies, statutory, voluntary, grassroots, etc. It's a great space for sharing information, innovation, good practice, and more importantly, identifying gaps and challenges for women coming out of prison. I think what I would say is perhaps more could be done about how it can inform commissioning decisions, because I think if it's got everybody if it's got all those agencies there, you're losing a lot of, as Elizabeth says, valuable intelligent information about this client group. And that commissioning could be made much more, you'd have much more added value from that commissioning because you've got all the participant agencies around the table.
Thank you. Rose, did you have anything to say on the Blueprint Group?
Yeah, just that I think it's that bit, isn't it, commissioning? There's both the commissioning at a regional level, but there is also local authority commissioning. That's really important. I think local authorities are underrepresented, so how the Blueprint Delivery Group disseminates that information, shares that learning, how the Mayor shares that learning, examples of best practice, data, all of that to inform both that regional commissioning, but also what can be done locally and by local authorities, either individually or collectively with neighbouring boroughs.
Yeah, thank you. And you've all made references to what more could be done. So could I specifically ask what you feel what more the GLA could do to support the group and support outcomes from it? Before you answer, because we want to hear the kids will want to hear your answers.
I just wanted to, once you settled, wanted to welcome Deptford Green School, who are going to be observing us. Welcome to the Housing Committee, to all of you. So I should have waited until you sat down, but just to say that we are discussing housing for women leaving prison today, so you're very welcome. So back to you.
That's fine. So yes, just what specifically could the GLA do more to support the group and support the outcomes of the group? I think you made reference to dissemination of
I think that's a really valuable bit. And we are talking about smaller numbers.
Yeah.
Obviously, it's a smaller percentage of the prison population of people in contact with the criminal justice system are women. But that's not necessarily a negative. So often for us in Lambeth, we see that as the opportunity to trial, to pilot, to think about, well, what learning can we take from this smaller cohort that can be applied to the wider system? So there's something around, yes, it is a smaller number, but their needs are greater, which means that there's both a human and economic cost to not taking specific, specialist and tailored responses. But actually, you can try things. You can look at, well, what is that learning that can be applied to a smaller cohort that then can be disseminated to inform changes to the wider system. So I think that's often the benefit of that. And what the GLA's approach is that they obviously represent the whole of London and can support local areas to think about, what is the relevant data, because local authorities won't necessarily always have that. So what data is available that can inform commissioning? What are the examples of best practice, but also where is there the funding to trial things, to pilot responses?
Thank you. Sorry, Zyber and Elizabeth, did you have anything else? It's your opportunity to specifically tell us what the GLA should do, so you may want to take it.
I think for fear of echoing everything that's been said already, I wonder if the GLA can support more local authorities to attend that group, because I think being at the table is really important, and hearing firsthand what is going on for that client group and what some of the issues are can be really powerful. But I think the data and the dissemination are also the critical factors.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think very similar in terms of involvement and engagement and constant communication with the group, right? And I mean, as it's been said, in terms of good practice, but also things that don't work. Yeah. I think that's very important. There's a particular element I haven't mentioned up to now, but it's engagement with women with lived experience. Again, at Hibiscus, we are internally having conversations on how you do the engagement with women with lived experience in a safe way, but also in a meaningful way. Because many engagement up to now has become not really meaningful and can end up re-victimizing and re-traumatizing women. But how do you do this in collaboration with the specialist organizations to listen to women? Because they have gone through the process.
Yeah.
They have seen the failures, they have felt the failures of agencies not responding to their needs, right? And they are usually very invisible in this process and in these discussions. But in order to avoid any tick-boxing exercise, it's about having these honest conversations on how we involve women with lived experience in a way that feels that it's truly listening to what they are saying and to what they need. So I think this is an important element of that.
And is that, because of the small numbers, is that potentially something that's more effectively done at a London level and then that sort of be spread out? Is that what you're thinking?
Yeah, I think the expert by experience and involvement of those with lived experience across the board is just inconsistent. It's still quite a new thing. So Lambeth has an experts by experience panel which is specifically for gender-based violence survivors, victims and survivors, but that's still quite a new model. It's not. It's been quite a long-standing model in things like substance misuse services, but the application is still quite new across the board. And again, it comes to, well, where is there examples of best practice? How can, because boroughs end up just trying to do things that already exist elsewhere, and that's just not very efficient. So how do we pull together those examples of best practice? And again, it comes back to how do we disseminate those so that there is learning that they can then be tailored to the local areas.
Thanks. That's really helpful. And my second question is about the Women's Prison Release Practice Briefing. And the question is, how effective has that specifically been in improving multi-agency approach? And have you seen an impact? Cyber?
I think it's difficult to say whether there's been a specific impact, essentially. But I think, all 10 recommendations are really, they almost echo some of the things that we've talked about today, essentially. So I think that's heartening to see that that's reflected in a practice briefing, really. I think for us, really, the housing pathways elements are the most, as you would expect as a housing provider, those are the most important for us. But I think it's very difficult to say what specific it's great to have it all set out very clearly as guidance for other agencies.
Does it assist to make sure that different agencies are on the same page? Do you feel?
I think
if you
so,
can't measure an impact.
Yeah,
maybe that was
it helps to bring consistency
to
the piece, essentially.
Thanks.
Yeah, I think it can help to bring consistency, right? But it's not only about the guidance and the briefing itself, it's how it's connected and interconnected to the other processes that are happening at the same time, right? The briefing brings a lot of important evidence and recommendations, as it's been said, in terms of reflecting what we see. There's this specific recognition of the particular experiences of Black and minoritized migrant women. And I guess the value of it's in the practice, and see how it can be replicated and put into practice by the agencies and by the local authorities. So.
It's going to come back to dissemination again. How is that provided, and how is the case made, particularly in the current climate? Local authorities are dealing with very significant pressures and competing priorities. And I think that almost it can get lost, because it is realistically it's a very small number of people. But I think it's the case to be made that there really does need to be specific and gender responsive support, but that's sometimes part of the role is about piloting. It's building that evidence base so that that can then be shared to inform ongoing work and be picked up then at a local level. But I think that is, we would want to see, and it is about disseminating, but it's also about how is the case made to local areas to whom this is maybe newer and where they are really small numbers, to think about, well, what are the benefits? And both the benefits, I'll come back to the kind of human and economic benefits of that type of approach.
Thank you. That's back to you, Chair.
Thank you. Assembly Member Garbett.
Thanks. I'm going to pick up on a couple of comments from earlier, but open with just asking what extent are prisons and prison staff able to provide housing support for women in that pre-release phase. I know there's been a couple of comments about that, but I just want to understand what the specific challenges are in that pre-release phase for prisons. And Zyber, I was going to come to you because I've got a couple of follow-ups from what you were saying earlier as well.
I think, again, it depends on which prison, essentially. So I think for Bronzefield, obviously, they do have a resettlement, or I don't know what the specific role is, basically, but that resource is there, essentially. But our experience is that it's reasonably varied. I think there's such small teams, and I think you know, if there's an absence or whatever, you know, you're having to sort of try and make contact with different individuals within the prison for that, to gain all of that information for a woman's release, essentially. I don't know if people have got any particular...
I was going to ask Zyber just quickly while you've got the microphone. I was going to ask, earlier you mentioned that there was a referral to you for someone who has no recourse to public funds. Is that because the referrers didn't understand that you didn't take... I just thought it was interesting that a partner would refer to you if you couldn't support that person, and if... Yeah. I didn't know how that kind of occurred, and if that was an issue of people not understanding the kind of criteria that you've got.
I think in this case it was an issue of not understanding our criteria, because it's fairly clear how placements are funded, essentially, through housing benefit. But I think what can happen is that, going back to what other panel members have said, sometimes it's actually understanding what the status of that individual is and what their entitlements are, really. But that wasn't the case in this particular scenario.
That's really interesting. And earlier you were and you've all kind of touched on this, the importance of in-reach. I just didn't know if you mentioned just then that it's the capacity sometimes within the prison that makes that in-reach hard, but just anything else that makes that in-reach difficult?
Well, going back to the location of the prisons themselves, I mean, it's practically, it's not an impossibility, because we do it, essentially, but, you know, it is reliant on things like video calling, to do assessments, you know, whereas ideally when we were working with Holloway, we would be working with the women themselves and, you know, getting to know them and understanding. You know, you can get a better response from people face to face, ultimately, at the end of the day.
We very much appreciate you coming face to face. Did anyone else want to pick up on anything else just specifically about the prison barriers? Yeah.
I think on pre-release, just very quickly, something I haven't mentioned up to now is that what we see is that with the women we support, is that there's this misconception that they might not stay in the UK long term, and therefore no house needs are there, right? Because they might be moved to an immigration removal center, or because they might just come back home. But this is a very limited understanding of the different experiences of migrant women in here. Some migrant women in prison might have lived in the UK for 20 years. They might have already their life made in this country. So there's this misconception that it's very harmful for our service users. And I think just in terms of the support, so we do go to prisons and we see the difference in terms of doing the advocacy face-to-face with women and the value of that. Then, of course, it links back to the challenges of advocating and finding accommodation for women who might not have access to public funds. And as I said before, I basically prevented from accessing accommodation. But an important point made by Seba has to do with the misconception of understanding every single no recourse to public funds case as non-access to any right or not being able to access any type of accommodation, when there's cases of, for instance, pre-settled women who have pre-settled status, who just, if they get back to work, they'll be able, their benefits be able to kick in back in. So there needs to be a lot of understanding of what it means to be no recourse to public funds, and of course making it difficult to understand is part of the violence of the immigration system itself. But for local authorities, for agencies, that should be an obligation and not just an excuse to reject women from accessing support and accommodation.
Thank you. Anything else, Rose? I know you've spoken a bit about this already, but yeah.
Just, I suppose, obviously the location, but also when people are released, that if there is an in-reach and they're released at 5 p.m, that makes things extremely difficult. So I think there's just something about that. And also we're talking about people who are then coming to our attention. There's plenty of women who aren't necessarily coming to our attention because they are going to stay with friends, family, etc. And I think that needs to be, it was touched upon before, but the way that women's homelessness looks very different to men's. So again, kind of rough sleeping strategies or work around rough sleeping. They're generic, but they're not generic because the majority of people rough sleeping are men. So they are tailored to men, and the way that women rough sleep is very, very different, but also that there are lots of women who, the kind of hidden homeless that we know about, and I think that's really important because that's why we have to have triangulated data. Is the prisons will know how many people are leaving, local authorities will know how many people they're getting, but those won't be the same numbers. And I think that's just something around how we and the role, I guess, of the GLA is around pulling data. How do we use that data in an efficient way to then inform regional and local commissioning?
Great, thank you. Back to you, Chair, but I think it might be me. But right, just in case there are any follow-ups from anyone. To me again, different topic. So just want to talk a bit about the Women's Justice Board. So the government's new Women's Justice Board is to consider the alternatives to prison for women engaged in criminal justice systems, such as community sentences and residential women's centres. And I just wanted to get your views on the impact of that if it's implemented, particularly on long-term housing. I'm not sure who would like to start. Elizabeth or Zyber, did you want to? Yeah.
So when we're sort of, we know about the board, but we're unsure about who's on it, and I think ultimately for us, we want to link into those members or the relevant members. In terms of alternatives to custody or diversion schemes, really, I think what I would say is that prevention is the most important thing, and we're starting to think about how our project might evolve further, really, to deliver some diversion schemes. Obviously, we'd need to do that in collaboration with statutory and the voluntary sector that we already work with. But because we know the demographics of the women that are coming out, the index offences, as you know, much shorter custodial sentences, much lower level offences. We think there's a very good argument to provide a diversion service, accommodation based, essentially, where women are getting the support that they need, where obviously public protection is managed effectively going forward. So, as I say, in terms of the link to the board itself, because we're not linked into that, I can't comment on that. But I think anything that prevents women from being incarcerated, really, and having to serve prison sentences, because as Rose has commented on, the cost of women being in prison is far greater than just that one individual person. I think it's something like £60,000 to keep a woman in prison for a year. But there's also the impact on her family, potentially they're usually caregivers or parents, so the care costs for that family, and then any other potential health or mental health needs and the costs that relate to that. So I think using those costs is a really great argument for an alternative to custody for women.
Thanks, that's really well described, and I think lots of us felt from our visit to Bronzefield that there was a lot more that could have been done to prevent and support women in a different way. Yeah, Elizabeth, did you want to come in?
Just very brief, I think it's many of the points that we have been shared. The Women's Justice Board was welcomed by us in terms of the announcement and the aims in terms of reducing the numbers of women in prison because of the reasons that have been mentioned. There must be an explicit consideration of housing because we know the impact that not having housing can have on women, and the specific focus on Black and minoritized migrant women. And I say this very explicitly because one of the processes happening at the same time is the sentencing review, and we were really disappointed that as part of the terms of reference there was nothing around the impact of structural racism in sentencing, and we think that the Women's Justice Board needs to address this specific issue because it has such a weight on the experiences of the women we support from the beginning until the end when leaving prisons and looking to access housing. Thank you.
Great, thank you.
Just really echoing, and obviously in terms of thinking about that data of the prison release service in Lambeth, that you have got such a higher percentage of returning referrals within a year, which is due to those short sentences. That's super disruptive because if somebody is recalled or they're going back in on a really short sentence, they're losing accommodation or you have to restart the process again. So there is just an inefficiency there, as well as obviously the massive impact that has on caring responsibilities, which again was obviously raised in the previous meeting, but we all know about the evidence around. That's one of the very, very specific differences, is women are not just carers of children, but carers more generally in society, and that then has a massive knock-on effect. So I think we would welcome that just in terms of the human cost of that, and looking again at, if we know that so many of these women are also victims and survivors of different forms of VOG, what are we doing there? So, the kind of, there is that economic bit, but there's also the human element and the human cost that is much more far-reaching than just the accommodating somebody within a prison.
Great. Thank you all. Back to you, Chair.
Thank you. Assembly Member Boff.
Kind of covered earlier, I talked about how we can recreate the Lambeth model or something similar to the Lambeth model in other boroughs. Is there any kind of support that the GLA could give to spread that good practice?
We really welcomed being in the practice briefing as an example, so that's really useful, but it is going to be more difficult in this climate, and I think that is around, come back to the role of the GLA is around piloting, it's about using specific funding, but also to think about who are they reaching, because just at a local level, I think it's reasonably unusual that I am the lead commissioner for VOG services and services for adults in contact with the criminal justice system. They don't always sit together, so there is real benefit there, and I think that kind of bit around who's around the table in those discussions can be very beneficial, because there are local authorities, they're big organisations, so sometimes just around are the right people being spoken to. So I think most local authorities would really welcome the opportunity to work with the GLA around, well, who is the right person to talk to, and where are the opportunities for us to draw on examples across the city, both of good practice, but also what's the evidence for things needing to change, and what's the business case, because that's really valuable.
Should there be like a dedicated London-wide pathway for women leaving prison, rather than trying to funnel people through the existing programmes, the regular affordable housing system? Would a separate system help? I mean, that would have a lot of questions on it even then, or challenges even then, but it would provide a separate system rather than competing with the affordable housing pressures that there are in local authorities.
Potentially, I'd really be interested in my colleagues' viewpoint on that, because, as I said, most of the women who are coming to us, there is something about women leaving prison, because, as I said, lots of them are not coming to our attention. They may be going elsewhere, to friends and family. But most of the women who are coming to our attention have significant needs. I mean, that's some of the part of the kind of incarceration of women, is that we're putting very vulnerable, or women who have experienced multiple disadvantage, into the prison system. But they are eligible for lots of different types of very specialist support. So within our supported housing pathway, there are tailored support that meets their needs, that is actually not just to do with their history of contact with the criminal justice system, because I think that's something that women often talk about, is that they are only seen through that lens, as opposed to not being seen, that they're not seen for all of their intersecting elements of their identity. So there may be benefit to that, but it has to work alongside other things that they may actually they may want to have, not specific prison release accommodation. They may want accommodation that meets their other needs.
And do you think the Mayor should appoint a dedicated liaison officer on this issue, to ensure that there's a more consistent approach across London, both with councils and the G15 and housing providers?
I think any additional resource that can shine a light on this client group would be, welcomed. I think my slight reservation is that sometimes, if you have a specific voice, you sometimes take that resource from somewhere else, which I think is what Rose was kind of alluding to, really. But I think, going back to your previous question about whether a housing path, a singular housing pathway for women coming out of prison would be a good thing. I think it would be a good thing, in the sense that it would bring together a lot of the consistency that we've been talking about today. But I think it is important to remember that these are women first. They happen to have been in prison. A lot of them have long and enduring needs that need meeting through whichever route that is, mental health or physical health or social care. And I think really I think if there's some message for the GLA really and the mayors to promote, it's about seeing their journey through prison as a transient thing. They shouldn't be labelled by that, but they end up having specific needs as a result of that. So I think that's an important message, I think, to get for the GLA could share.
Would you like to?
Just very quickly, I think effectiveness also will be linked to resourcing and pathways for collaboration and communication with the different actors involved, right? And in terms of solutions for housing through the intersectional needs, we need to be very aware that one-size-fits solution doesn't necessarily work for those who are pushed to the margins, right? So all these considerations need to be put on the table. And we go back to the point of listening to women with lived experience, listening to the organizations, working with them. So that would need to be central to any effort to centralize the decision-making. Otherwise, we risk marginalizing them further.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Assembly Member Baker.
Thank you, Chair. And my question is about the range of programmes that the Mayor runs related to homelessness and housing, which in some form provide housing to women leaving prison, but not specifically. So do you think these programmes are doing enough, are contributing enough in the right way to the needs of housing needs of women leaving prison, including wraparound women's centre services that also in some cases will be providing those services? Does that make sense? Yeah. Rose?
So the wraparound services, the Pan London service, and I think that is really excellent. But again, it comes back to that. I do think there probably is more that local authorities could do to be part of that and to look at aligned commissioning, not necessarily becoming co-commissioners, but aligned commissioning with that. And that's sometimes the tension between the between a regional response and then with so many local authorities in London. But I think that is doing lots. There's also the rough sleeping accommodation programme and the single homelessness accommodation programme for rough sleepers or former rough sleepers, and that can include women, but they're not specific support dedicated to that cohort. And again, it comes back to that kind of hidden homeless for women, which is different. But I think there is lots in terms of kind of the Pan London service that's still new, and I think we need to say that the wraparound service is still a fairly new provision that we hope to see grow and develop, but certainly really welcoming a specific response, and obviously MOPAC's alignment for unsentenced women, because that's really important in terms of thinking about that prevention. Certainly locally in Lambeth, we really welcome the ability to look at that, but we welcome our relationship as co-commissioners, because it allows us to also think creatively about what else there is out there, so that we can bolster that provision, that we can think about how it intersects with our other provisions. There can always be more. That's the general.
That's fine. Thank you. Elizabeth?
Yeah, no, we do provide wraparound services as part of the co-commission, and we see the advantages and the benefits that brings to women, especially for the cohort of women we support in terms of the specialist support and the understanding of the particular needs. So definitely we think it needs to continue, and not only that, it needs to be developed and be made sustainable. Again, we go back to funding, right? Because when we are about on the cliff edge of the funding, it becomes quite difficult and quite stressful for the organization, and the risk of women losing the opportunity to be supported. Just, again, as I've been saying the whole session, we need an additional funding for women with no recourse, because then they fall to the cracks, and that means we have a number of women who basically are left behind without any type of support.
Thank you. Zaiba, did you have anything to?
I think I'm going to add anything material. I mean, obviously, we concur with the sort of whole wraparound services. We've been part of those for a little while now. I think ultimately it's a case of sort of supply. So we need more housing. We need more appropriate housing that's suitable for women at all levels, but particularly those coming out of prison.
That's fine. Thanks. Back to you, Chair.
Thank you. Assembly Member Small-Edwards.
Thank you, Chair. According to the GLA, reducing the number of people experiencing rough sleeping having left an institution like prisons will be a key objective in the Mayor's second rough sleeping plan of action. In your view, how should the needs of women who have left prison be reflected in this plan? And additionally, what specific resources are required to prioritise the needs of women leaving prison? Start with Rose and then move across.
So they should be a specific cohort with specific funding. They do, I think it's around that bit that comes back to generic is not generic, it is for men. And so we need a specialist, flexible and specific services that are thinking about those different needs, that understand that rough sleeping for women looks very different if you're thinking about who they're looking to for safety. So that's obviously the huge overlap with domestic abuse, is that it's really it's dangerous for anybody to be rough sleeping. It's additionally dangerous for women to be rough sleeping. And so there will often be the kind of how somebody who is rough sleeping seeks some level of safety, but the additional risk that that can then cause, and that often accommodation isn't necessarily tailored to that. And again, that there are so many needs. We need to have person-centred approach and really thinking about individuals overlapping and intersecting needs. So thinking about substance misuse, mental health, and access to services to support those, as well as the overlaps with violence against women and girls.
I think I'm just going to be repeating the same, because that's the key element in terms of understanding how different experiences of women are, and within women, the different experiences of the different cohorts of women. There's something specific about the impact of the immigration status in pushing them to rough sleeping, and this needs to be bear into consideration, but also the consequences of rough sleeping that rough sleeping might have on their immigration status. So it's a bit of a loop in there, and that's something that needs to be central to any strategy.
Repeat some of the same things again, but just to give a specific example, really, again, would echo that we think that the rough sleeping solution for women needs to be very specific. I think just in terms of identifying rough sleeping women to be assessed as bedded down and to be on the database for rough sleepers is really difficult for women, because women are moving around all the time. They don't feel safe to be in the same shop doorway or whatever, wherever they've slept the night before. So that in itself can prevent data collection, so you don't really know who your cohort are that you're delivering services to. So I think really thinking about what the specific needs are of women, a lot of which has been talked around today, and I'm sure it's been talked about in other committees.
Thank you very much. That's incredibly helpful. Back to you, Chair.
Thanks. I've got a couple of follow-ups to some of the things you said. At the last session that we had members of GLA staff, so officers, and we did have a bit of a conversation around that commitment that my colleague has mentioned around reducing the number of people rough sleeping. And in your responses, you've kind of, I think, said much more eloquently what I was trying to say around a specific set of interventions for women in that plan. So I wonder, as and when that develops, whether either individually or collectively, as a sector working with women and their housing need, whether that's something that you'll be responding to kind of make that case so that that's reflected, because I think that's important for resourcing both kind of people and also money from both the GLA but also local authorities. But I wanted to also just really quickly ask you to follow up around Assembly Member Boff's point about a separate system specifically for London. And obviously we've been to Bronzefield, so we know where it is, but I haven't really appreciated that there is no longer a London prison. And so, yes, I just wonder your thoughts on what that might look like. So obviously we're here in the Housing Committee, and the Deputy Mayor for Housing and Residential came with us on that visit, whether a responsibility of some kind would sit here and kind of in the housing function or in the Deputy Mayor for Police and Crime under her remit, or nobody's really that bothered as long as it happens somewhere. Just wondered kind of where you would start. I'm trying to kind of tease out some recommendations from you, I think.
I think it's interesting that bit around the linking that there already is. So there's the police and crime plan is currently in consultation, the violence against women and girls, the Mayor's Office, Mayor's Violence Against Women and Girls strategy is in consultation. There's the real benefit there of that overlap, that recognition of it doesn't take away from one to reference another. So within the rough sleeping strategy, that it would be useful to recognise that that overlaps with a VORG strategy, so that there are those specific recognition that you can't address one without thinking about the other. And I think that probably comes back to then that pathway. Everywhere I think will welcome additional resource. So a pathway that does provide additional resource is really useful. But I think there's something around the need to engage with local authorities on that to make sure that it's not meeting a need that then almost stops it being met elsewhere, and that is really aligned with what local areas might be doing. So that's that bit around that regional and local, and it works best when those are really strongly aligned.
I don't think I have anything to add. To completely agree with the answer and what I mentioned before in terms of making sure that there's a consistent approach, that it's resourced and that considers the different experiences of women.
Again, just to echo, I mean, I think having a pathway that does link with those other strategies, essentially the VORG strategy, particularly because of the high levels of women experiencing VORG in prison. But I do also agree that what can happen is once you have a pathway, resources are just focused in that one area, really. So I think it's really important that all the local authorities appreciate what they should be doing under some of the other guidance that we've talked about today.
And I just have one additional question for you, Zaiba, as a housing provider. What your views are around. So we've got the Affordable Homes Programme set to be renewed and refreshed. Mm-hmm. We have kind of classifications of what categories are supported or sheltered housing that are required in London. Mm-hmm. What your views are around specifically providing homes within the programme or some other way for women leaving prison. Rose mentioned 46 women a year, last year. So across London, it's around 1,500 units. I'm just kind of back to our last session, I'm a bit fixated on a number. I feel like we don't have a number. Probation mentioned a vanishingly small number, and kind of just to pin something down, I suppose. What are your views on building homes to support women, even if it's some kind of move on? I don't know how you feel about that.
Bit of a multifaceted answer, really. In terms of supported housing, I think we're not clear ourselves, really, about the new supported housing standards. So there is a need for, I know there are some programmes that the GLA are running, really, around supported housing, and capital monies that might be available to help improve the standards of that accommodation. So I think the continuation of that support would be very welcomed, I think, by housing providers, because I think there's a bit of a quandary at the moment between sort of a lot of supported housing is homes in multiple occupation, and I suspect that won't meet the standards that are going to be required going forward, so there will be some refurbishment or modernisation of that accommodation that exists, or building new accommodation that meets that standard, whether that comes out of the 80,000 homes that the Mayor's been asked to provide. I don't know. In terms of move-on accommodation, I would say that's absolutely essential. I think you can't have successful projects like the ones that we're running and the ones that's running in Lambeth without having the move-on, otherwise you just get salting up in that project. And even though you've only got 42 or 49 women coming out of prison every year, if those women who need the support can't move on to independent accommodation, then it brings that project to a bit of a standstill, essentially. I think if there's a specific programme for Move On, I think that would be welcomed across the board, because it's beyond sort of just women coming out of prison, but certainly for domestic abuse services, etc., which we have a lot of experience of. It's about finding affordable. I would say I've always said truly sort of social rented accommodation as opposed to what's considered to be affordable rent.
Yeah.
Just on that, I think it's to say from that Lambeth cohort. So we do have the accommodation for ex-offenders scheme, AFIA, but most of the women who are coming to the attention of the prison release navigator who are being referred are not suitable for that, because it does require the ability to live independently. So I think it's around that investment in really specialist supported accommodation. Definitely there needs to then be the think around Move On, but real investment in supporting people to address their multiple needs, and with that vision and ambition that they're then able to live independently.
My final question, this is a broad generalisation, but this was a couple of years ago. We did a visit, the committee, to supported accommodation for women, and I suppose one of the features, this is my generalisation, I don't know, is that you will have women coming out of prison with children, with families, that perhaps you don't see that as much with men to an extent. So I don't know, balancing the need to provide for not just the woman, but children and other dependents in that accommodation. Do you see that as something that the GLA should be aiming for in its overall programme, to think about kind of how people live their lives, not just units in the upcoming AHP or, I don't know, some other commissioned housing that we may have that's out with the police and crime kind of function. So whichever you wants to go first, and then.
I mean, I would say definitely, you know, there is a need for. It's not just single women coming out of prison, essentially, but there is a particular issue, I understand, which is around whether women are able to maintain custody of their children when they go into prison, which is an issue that needs to be addressed sort of separately and is probably beyond the scope of the GLA, but. Because ultimately what we're finding is women are losing. What we're trying to do with women is help them to maintain access to see their children who might be in social care or other arrangements, really. So they're not necessarily in a position to be rehoused with their children following prison. But obviously there are some women coming out of prison who are pregnant and who will have that opportunity. So I think family-sized accommodation is important in the wider consideration for this group.
Yeah, completely agree, and I think that gets us back to the women-centered approach and understanding the different experiences of women, some of them and many of them who might be having caring responsibilities that have been disrupted by prison. So providing accommodation that allows them to be there with the children it's basic. It's really important.
If a woman comes out pregnant, then she would be accommodated with, obviously, would be accommodated in accommodation that is suitable for a child. If somebody has lost, if the children are in the care of either family, or friends, local authority, they won't be accommodated in housing that has space for those children because those children are not in her care. So that then is the barrier to regaining any kind of care of children. It does come back to the disruptive nature of short-term sentences that are really specific, and particularly when we're talking about non-violent offences. So there is that overlap with the sentencing review and thinking about the specific impact of sentencing on women that is different. But that is a barrier. It's a barrier to regaining any kind of custody and access to your children, is that if you've lost care of them through going to prison, then you can't be accommodated somewhere that would then support you regaining custody.
Okay, thank you very much. That's been really illuminating. I don't know if there are any final questions from any members before. Yes, sure.
Earlier on, you all spoke about the kind of taking a holistic approach. I'm really interested in people's access to drug and alcohol and other drug treatment. And I know there's a requirement to get people into treatment within 28 days of being released from prison. But I just wondered if anyone could speak to the importance of those services being available and considered at the time that maybe Rose, like how you consider that when people are being released from prison.
Yeah, in Lambeth, we used OHID funding to think about specific needs of kind of through the gate support. Difficult when the gate is so far away, but through the gate support for women leaving prison with substance misuse issues and concerns and needs. That's a really big part of it. We know, again, you can't look at anything in isolation. We know how much more likely women who've experienced VOG are to use substances as a coping mechanism, and the additional vulnerability to higher risk forms of violence if they are using substances. So it's that importance of looking at all of those intersecting needs that it comes back to. But yes, substance misuse as a specific support need and offer is really vital. And again, I think that comes back to Lambeth, where we have taken creative and collaborative commissioning approaches to really maximise the funding that is available, so working really closely with other commissioners in other teams. And I think that's something that can be really beneficial and is an example of best practice, particularly as we approach those potentially more difficult financial circumstances.
Thank you all. And thank you to Rose, Elizabeth and Zyba for your contributions today. Can we note the report and today's discussion? Can we also delegate authority to me as chair in consultation with party group lead members to agree any output arising from this discussion? Can we note the committee's work programme? The date of the next meeting of the committee is the 26th of February 2025 at 2 p.m. in the chamber here at City Hall. I have no urgent business and I declare this meeting closed.
This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by.